Why I chose to be homeless at 13. Surviving a horrific childhood and enduring abuse before escaping to build a better life. My earliest memory of my mom is burned into my brain. It was her choking on her own vomit in the back room of my grandparents' house. I must have been around 5 or 6. Apparently, she had been out all night drinking and causing trouble with her deadbeat biker friends, or so my grandparents' hushed conversations suggested. They had dragged her intoxicated self to that room, telling me to let her rest. Being the obedient kid I was, I did just that for hours until my curiosity got the best of me. I tiptoed down the hallway to listen in on her through the door. I'll never forget the sound of her snoring. I felt a weird sense of relief. Pop, my granddad, had told me she was just really tired and needed rest. And for those few hours, I believed him. But I was dying to know what was really happening. While my grandparents got engrossed in the evening news, I snuck down the hall to press my ear against her door. It must have been fate or sheer dumb luck that day. Hearing her snore made me feel like everything was okay. My innocent little mind hadn't yet been shattered by her actions, but then her snoring changed to a troubling sound. Alarmed, I quietly cracked the door open. She had thrown up while lying on her back, and the thick mess was all over her nose and mouth. I remember the gross bubble of vomit expanding and contracting with her breath. Then she started to convulse. Terrified, I screamed for help, and my grandma rushed in. That's why when I overheard my grandparents saying I had saved her life, I felt proud. That night, I was a hero for stopping her from choking to death. Sadly, that feeling of pride would turn to regret in the years that followed. My parents were only 19 when I was born, in 1982. They spent the next decade living it up drinking, partying, and leaving me with my grandparents. Life was mostly good and stable with them. My grandparents adored me. Out of their 6 kids, they had only one son who wasted his life on drugs and jail time. I think they saw me as their second chance. At the time, I had no idea that my grandma battled numerous mental health issues, hidden alcoholism, depression, and pathological lying. To me, she was just an amazing storyteller. Every night, she'd spin the most captivating tales, everything from pirates hunting treasure to eerie ghost stories. I'll never forget her chilling stories about Bloody Mary or Black Aggie, a local ghost legend. If she wasn't up for creating a new story, she'd read from any book I chose. That's how I fell in love with Stephen King at a young age. Her reading Pet Sematary to me is a core memory that sparked my lifelong love of reading. She even did different voices for the characters, a habit I've continued when reading to my own kids. Up until I was 10, my life was filled with bedtime stories, midnight snacks, and the steady love of my grandparents. My mom was still wrapped up in her self-absorbed life, and I barely saw her except for the rare times she sobered up enough to stay with us for a while. But then my grandma's mental health took a nosedive. Her depression deepened, and her drinking increased. I remember finding empty liquor bottles hidden in a basement cupboard and showing them to my granddad. They had a huge fight later. The next morning, I woke up to find my grandfather sitting on the edge of my bed, tears streaming down his face. "Grandma left us, Bubba," he told me, using my nickname, which usually meant I was in trouble. I felt guilty for finding those bottles. "It's just you and me now. I'm gonna need your help. You gotta be a big boy for Pop." That morning, I watched him make us French toast, burning one side and leaving the other side raw. I didn't say anything and ate it anyway. Seeing him struggle with something so simple broke my heart. He was really trying. Sometime later, I got the news that my mom had fallen head over heels for someone. I met him, Mark. He's not one of those deadbeats she's used to hanging around with. He's got a good job and works hard. He even found your mom a job. And she wants to bring him to meet you. My grandfather told me one morning. I remember dreading it. Up until then, my mom's visits were a hurricane of chaos-drunken tears, fights, and general disruption. Little did I know how much worse things could get. Mom was in love. The guy's name was John, and from the get-go, I had a bad feeling about him. I cried my eyes out when Pop told me I'd be staying with them soon, just until he got used to life without Grandma. What I didn't know was that Grandma had left for good, deciding one morning to head to a homeless shelter and never return. Mom was eager to play house with her new man and me. I'll never forget that first night in their house. The walls were stained yellow from nicotine, dog hair covered everything, and the stench of stale beer, cigarettes, and dog poop still haunts me. Mom had been on her best behavior for Pop, not touching a drop of alcohol until we got to John's place, which seemed like hours away by car. The house was in the woods, on a quiet street with neighbors on either side. It looked nice from the outside, but was a mess inside, just like my mom. Initially, I was scared and sad, but there was a treehouse in the front yard, and John had promised that his 3 sons would be around soon for me to play with. I had no clue that his oldest son would become my tormentor. I spent the first day exploring the woods and meeting other kids on our street, trying to get my bearings. That first night, I holed up in my room with headphones on, trying to drown out the loud, drunken sex noises from down the hall. They didn't even bother to close their door. I had to get used to that. John hit me for the first time the next morning. They were both hungover, and I accidentally woke him up while asking Mom if I could have breakfast. It was already around noon, and I was used to eating early with my granddad. John smacked me across the face right in front of her. She told me I better start behaving because John wouldn't let me do whatever I want like Pop does. The fear and depression that settled in, knowing this was my life now, is indescribable. My stable world was shattered. My grandparents had abandoned me. Looking back, one of the saddest things is how quickly I adapted to the abuse. I learned to be invisible or gone while they drank in the evenings, and to tiptoe around in the mornings while they were hungover and irritable. I'd find a friend's house to stay at while they fought. I learned to lie to the social worker who sometimes showed up because the neighbors called the cops, and to my teachers about the bruises. After the first year, John's sons came to stay with us for a summer. He had lost custody of them, no surprise, and their mother had taken them to Florida, far from his Maryland home. But, like my mom, John went through phases where he wanted to be a father and fought the courts to see them. This led to them coming up every summer. I hated it immediately. They took my room, and I was banished to sleep in the cold, damp, unfinished basement while John's eldest, Samuel, took my room. His other sons shared the spare room. Before they started coming, I looked forward to the evenings when John and Mom would drink and pass out in that spare room. They had 2 computers in there and would stay up playing a NASCAR game until they conked out. That was my chance to sneak into the kitchen and steal something to eat. Mom constantly harped on me about being fat and how Pop should never have let me eat so much. They locked up any easy-to-prepare food in a couple of cupboards. When they passed out, I had a window to get those locks open and eat. I was always hungry because Mom was erratic about feeding me. When she did cook, I had to eat at the kitchen table while they watched TV in the living room. She'd plop my plate down and say, "Here's your piggy portion." To this day, I have issues with eating. I can't eat in restaurants because I'm so used to sneaking off with food to eat alone that I feel extreme anxiety eating in public. John only really liked his eldest son, Sam, probably because he was just as obnoxious as his dad. Loud and crude, unlike the other 2, who were quiet and reserved. Sam waited about a week before he started sneaking down to the basement at night to torment me. The first time he woke me up by being inappropriate, I cried and cried. But eventually, even that horror numbed me. I knew nobody would believe me, so I stayed silent. The shame of it all haunted my nightmares. That became my norm. Summers of mistreatment, winters filled with my mom's bipolar swings, worsened depression, and intensified drinking and abuse. I spent so much time at my friend Ben's house down the street that his dad joked about charging me rent. I think he understood why I was there so often and didn't mind my presence. Outwardly, I was still a good kid. It took an outsider's perspective to make me see how bad my life had become. The day my friend Alan came over was a turning point. I knew they'd be working late that night. They'd been complaining about it all week, so I thought it would be a safe time to bring a friend over and show off my video games. The one perk of John's good job was the expensive toys he'd buy for his sons, which I got to play with once they went back home. I was excited to play Super Nintendo with a friend instead of by myself in silence. We were in the middle of a game when I heard the front door open and my mom screaming about a bike left on the porch. Her usual tirade began, and I saw the fear on Alan's face. He had a normal life, where a mother screaming obscenities wasn't something he had to deal with. I whispered for him to hide in my closet, and he did. I wasn't allowed to have friends over, and I was terrified of what she'd do to him. Mom was great at pretending to be normal in public. At home, the mask came off. She stormed into my room, screaming about the bike, which was Alan's, though she didn't know, on the porch, accusing me of trying to make her break her neck. She grabbed a metal spatula on her way in to hit me with. The metal was so much worse than a belt, and soon I was crying, shaking, and covered in snot. Then it was over. She left for the liquor store with John. When I opened the closet and saw Alan's face, I had an epiphany. This was not normal. It was my normal, but it was far from okay. I was done. I walked Alan home and then wandered into the woods by myself. I thought about all the CPS visits, the midnight gropings, the beatings and abuse. I was done. I decided that couch surfing for the rest of school was infinitely better. I could do it. I had friends. So I did. It took a month for them to realize I hadn't been home at all. Mom didn't report me missing. She didn't want me brought back. She wanted to punish me for leaving. That's why I got arrested my first week of 6th grade. That's when my good kid reputation was blown to bits. Having the fire marshal handcuff me in class did the trick. He wouldn't even tell me what I'd done until I was in the back of his truck. He said I was going to jail for trying to burn my mom's house down. That's what she had cooked up. I spent 3 months in the J. DeWeese Carter Youth Facility. My first night, I was in a cell with a bully who openly harassed me. I spent that night huddled in a corner. That place was a different kind of hell. But that's another story. Fortunately for me, the friend I had been staying with knew what happened to me and what I had been going through. His parents weren't about to let me rot in there forever. Their family friend, a really good lawyer, took my case pro bono. I didn't even know people were fighting for my release. It would have made those dark, lonely nights more bearable. But as soon as my case got before a judge, it was dismissed due to lack of evidence. I'm sure the thick CPS file helped too, and that led to my emancipation. My life slowly got better as I learned to cope with my past. It had its ups and downs, but overall, I felt truly free for a long time after.